Harry the Spy, The Mysterious Snow. Chapter 1. Psst! Harry looked up. Psst! The noise was coming from the spy hole in the garden fence. Harry peered through the small hole. The leafy foliage of summer had gone, and only stark, bare twigs interrupted his view of Mrs. Joyce's brown eyes. "What was the message, Harry?" she asked urgently. "It was from Caccabanjo," said Harry. "And?" prompted Mrs. Joyce. Harry paused, then, "Have you ever been to Caccabanjo?" he asked. Mrs. Joyce nodded. "My brother says it doesn't even exist," said Harry. "But has he ever been there?" asked Mrs. Joyce. Harry shook his head. "Well then, how would he know?" Harry shrugged. She was right, of course. How could he know? Mrs. Joyce asked eagerly, "What was the message, Harry?" Harry screwed up his eyes and focused. He must recollect as exactly as he could the information he had heard. Any detail might be vital to save his country. He had written phrases on the handy piece of paper he kept for such eventualities. The "just in case" piece of paper was rolled up in a tight tube and kept in a plastic capsule that slotted into the side of his field agent spy watch. He removed the paper, and Mrs. Joyce drew nearer, paying close attention. You see, Harry was a spy, not a boy who only thought he was, not just pretending with all the gadgets he had received as gifts, but Harry really was a spy. He was also a good spy. He took his instructions from the Key to Life book, as we shall find out later in the story. Of course, plenty of people didn't think he was a spy. He was only a schoolboy after all. His parents didn't seem to believe him, even though they were kind about it and said things like, "That's nice, dear," when he explained about the secret codes and messages he really truly could hear. His older brother and sisters didn't believe him either, because Harry seemed to be the only one who could do all these spy-like things. Others couldn't when they tried. Only Harry could see through walls, although the view was always quite shadowy and vague, with the X-ray vision binoculars his aunt had brought him from Amazon for Christmas. He was the only one who could hear secret messages with the ear extension Grandad and Grandma bought him for his birthday. The motion alarm worked best for him. Only Harry could truly see in the dark with the night spire, and so it was with the rest of his spy gear as well. Nobody else seemed to understand, apart from his friend Mrs. Joyce. Mrs. Joyce was, in fact, Miss Joyce Fremantle. Harry didn't know this was her proper name. To him and his brother and sisters, the old lady who lived next door had always simply been Mrs. Joyce. Mrs. Joyce wasn't like other old ladies, who might have been fussy and particular and not understand about children who were noisy and messy. Mrs. Joyce understood. She kicked their footballs back over the fence. She never complained about their noise. She never complained about anything. She took a special interest in Harry's spy gear, quite often borrowing items from him and mending and improving them. It was no surprise to Mrs. Joyce that Harry had overheard a secret message from Caccabanjo. She expected these things to happen. It was no surprise to Harry that Mrs. Joyce appeared at the spy hole just when he was trying to figure out the mysterious code he had recorded. She always seemed to know when he needed help. Mrs. Joyce waited while Harry carefully examined the information he had logged from the Caccabangian message. His pencil was unfortunately blunt. In addition, he had nothing to lean on but an old tree, so all in all his writing was a bit messy. Slowly Harry read his notes. They said OPERA 20 IO 14 -1914 OW is all go. You're sure the second bit was 1914 OW? Yes, said Harry. Snow, mused Mrs Joyce, not seeming particularly surprised. Snow? Definitely snow. They're using a very crude code, probably so they don't use key words which might alert MI5, who of course will be listening. Or perhaps their code is simply to confuse any casual listener such as yourself, though of course they weren't to know you'd decipher it. Harry wasn't sure he'd deciphered anything. So the code they used... They've just substituted numbers for specific letters of the alphabet. So we know it's Operation Snow. What else? I missed a bit, and then there were numbers after that which I wrote down. 08 12 1650. HOUR 19. I thought that might be the time with the hour 19 bit, but I'm not sure. Good thinking, said Mrs Joyce. I think hour 19 spells out hours, with S being the 19th letter of the alphabet. But what is worrying is the date. 0812? Asked Harry. If I'm right, it stands for the 8th of the 12th month, but the 8th of December is... The day after tomorrow, said Harry. Exactly. We don't have much time. Mrs Joyce was very clever. Harry was certain she had once been a top secret spy. Perhaps she still was. He wondered how many real-life, dangerous and deadly puzzles she solved when she was working as a spy. It would fit in with the bigger picture, Mrs Joyce was muttering to herself. I wonder if it could possibly be, and we've hardly got any time at all. What? Harry asked eagerly. What could it be? Never mind that now, said Mrs Joyce, which Harry knew meant that he would probably never find out. For now, it's important to go through the detail. What else did you hear? Tell me as exactly as you can. Something about small 12 O 14 D O 14. Using the same code. Is it London? Asked Harry. I probably got the small bit muddled. They must have meant the big city of London. Or could it be Londonderry House? Though that's pretty big too. Or is small code for big? Harry realised that it wasn't particularly helpful to identify the city of London as the scene for a terrorist plot, since it was such a large place, and anything could be, and probably was, happening there. Perhaps there was a street called Small in London. Mrs Joyce said briskly, At any rate, I don't think it's Londonderry House, although that place could certainly bear investigation, but... Harry wondered if he would ever learn why Mrs Joyce thought that the large, stately home called Londonderry House, close to where he lived, might need investigating. But Mrs Joyce didn't stop to explain. Instead she continued, I think small means little, Little London. Harry didn't respond to that suggestion. For anything to be happening in the sleepy, respectable village of Little London, a few miles from his house, was ridiculous, and he was sure Mrs Joyce would see that too. Londonderry House might have all the necessary history, and cellars and dungeons, and suits of armour, to be the scene of a fantastic terrorist plot, but not Little London. But then Harry realised he had written down something else. Wait. 14 3 C 3 C. That's what they also mentioned. But if 3 is C in their code, that's probably too many C's. N C C C C, or not enough. So maybe I got that bit confused too. Harry was a little ashamed of his muddled scribblings, but it was hard to write everything down in the correct order when a message came through. But there were definitely quite a few C's in it, he added. Good, very good, Harry. What else? Mrs Joyce sounded urgent and excited. Harry was pleased. He tried to remember if there was anything else at all that might help. I think that was all, he admitted reluctantly after a pause. What will we do now?" "I think we need to visit London," said Mrs Joyce. "Perhaps we'll try the small version first." Chapter 2. Mrs Joyce paid Mum a visit that evening. Harry was doing his homework at the kitchen table. Mrs Joyce winked at him as she placed a lovely homemade apple pie on the table. "I had so many stewed apples I made 2 pies, Sylvie," she said. "I thought you could use one." "So kind," said Mum. "You always do so much for us, Joyce. You really shouldn't have gone to all that trouble." Adults always said things like that, and adults always kept going to the trouble. Mum and Mrs Joyce moved further away from the table, and Mum flicked on the kettle. Harry tried to pretend he was concentrating on his homework, but instead he removed his ear extension earpiece from his pencil case, deftly flicked the small switch to Home, and stuck it in his ear. If he had flicked it to the mysterious other setting, he might have heard secret messages, such as the one he had heard earlier about Caccabanjo. The ear extension looked like the hearing aid that Mrs Joyce wore, certainly not mysterious. Everyone in Harry's family was used to seeing it stuck in one ear. Nobody believed he heard anything special with it. Once Harry put the earpiece in, the conversation between Mum and Mrs Joyce suddenly became much, much louder, even above the noise of the kettle. Mrs Joyce was saying, "I wondered if I could borrow Harry again. I could pick him up from school if you can spare him." "Tea or coffee?" asked Mum. "I've got some of that nice Earl Grey you enjoy." "How lovely! Yes, the Earl Grey by all means. You see, Harry is such a helpful boy." "I'm sure he is." Mum sounded amused. "Oh, he is, I assure you. So if I could—" "Of course, I know he's always safe with you," said Mum. Both of them chuckled, although Harry didn't see what was funny. "I'll expect him home for tea. I wonder if I could give him tea too. There are a couple of projects he could help me with." Mum waved a hand expansively through the air. "Home for bed by 8 p.m. then," she said. Harry was sure that Mum didn't understand why Mrs Joyce needed his help. Mum knew that Mrs Joyce kindly supported Harry's interest in the world of spies, but there was something about this eavesdropped conversation that almost sounded as if Mum was in on the secret too. It couldn't be the case, of course. Mum didn't understand about spies and such stuff, did she? Harry doodled on his maths homework. He didn't particularly enjoy maths, but he did enjoy writing numbers and changing their appearance and disguising them, much as he might do when he was writing in a special code. All of a sudden he stopped, went very still, and stared at the numbers he had previously drawn on the opposite page. Only yesterday he had been disguising his 7 to look like an 8, which was pretty tricky considering they weren't similar at all. In the end, he had decided he could simply substitute one for the other, making the 7 a bit squiggly with extra lines coming off, and the 8 a bit straighter with faint lines for the round bits, which would indicate to him that he was writing in code. But the secret message, the one he had told Mrs Joyce about, the one he and Mrs Joyce were going to explore tomorrow. What if the 8 was intended to be a 7? Harry couldn't for the life of him remember whether he'd used his secret code or not. The spy message he'd written leaning on the bumpy tree bark was so messy it didn't give him any clues at all. But if 8 was actually 7, then the date wasn't the 8th of December, but the 7th. What if it was tomorrow? Perhaps Mrs Joyce's extraordinary powers of perception made her realize what had just occurred to Harry, or perhaps she merely decided to take a seat at the table by him with her mug of Earl Grey tea, while Mum cut up some lemon cake to eat. "Maths homework, Harry?" she asked, her eyes on the exercise book full of messy scribbling. You see here, Harry placed his pen to point to the numbers he had jotted, 8s that looked like 7s, and vice versa. I think 8 might be 7, you see, he said. Thankfully, Mrs. Joyce always immediately saw what others did not. Yes, she said, I see. Mrs. Joyce didn't stay long after that. I've just remembered some phone calls I should make, Sylvie, she said. Sorry to dash. Mum saw her to the door. Mrs. Joyce only had to walk out of their driveway and around the corner to her own house next door. Mum watched until she turned the corner, waving a hand until Mrs. Joyce disappeared from sight. Harry imagined the world of secret lines and communications that Mrs. Joyce must know all about, that she might even now be tapping into. Did she use Morse code, or have a hotline to the Prime Minister? Did she have secret agents living in her large attic, ready to carry messages to London? What about the stone outbuildings that were padlocked shut, and which Mrs. Joyce carefully guarded? Mrs. Joyce's house and grounds were full of hidden mysteries. To Harry, it seemed like exactly the type of place from which to overthrow a dastardly plot threatening their country. Tomorrow, Harry and Mrs. Joyce might have to save the world. Chapter 3. After school the next day, Mrs. Joyce drove Harry in her battered ancient car to the nearby village of Little London. Often Harry felt frustrated at the unexciting, sleepy villages by which his world was bounded. Places such as Bramley Hedge, Windy Alley, and his own safe, uninspiring hamlet of Lower Misling. There was not one single exciting thing that happened in these respectable villages that could make anyone imagine there might be a terrorist plot right here which could cause disaster to their nation. Surely there were no enemy spies here that would harm anyone. There were places close by where dark plots and desperate sabotage could be imagined, like Mizzle Abbey ruin, where ghosts were supposed to roam. People often stopped and took pictures of the ruin, and the tumble-stone certainly looked spooky, but there was precious little concealed space for anyone to hide or carry out an act of terrorism. The abandoned, decaying Mizzle Hall might conceivably be home to outlaws and bandits, though, or the stately Londonderry House, which Mrs. Joyce had already discounted. But surely not the leafy habitation which was Little London. "I've been very busy today, as you would expect," Mrs. Joyce was saying. "Phone calls to MI5 and MI6 too. I think we've stirred up some interest, but they're just not taking this seriously enough. I have a feeling in my bones about this one, and as you know, my bones are never wrong." Harry nodded. He trusted as implicitly as Mrs. Joyce did in her bones. He didn't ask many questions. Mrs. Joyce always spoke to him as if he knew precisely what was going on, and sooner or later he figured it out. "I've packed the Arctic gear," confided Mrs. Joyce. "I thought it best to be prepared. No new messages, I suppose?" Harry shook his head. He had been listening all day to the other channel on his earpiece, until his teacher confiscated his ear extension altogether. "Mrs. Penn took it from me in class," he said. Mrs. Joyce was comfortingly indignant. "Ridiculous," she said. "We've got a national emergency, the very security of our nation might be at stake, and teachers have no sense of perspective on the matter at all. Honestly, you would think—" "I got it back," said Harry. "You did? Just as well. Yes, start listening. Quick now, there may be an update we can tap into. Keep it on the other channel for now. And did you bring the locator I gave you? That's it, well done. Lovely to have such a reliable spy. Switch it to searching for trouble. Now, keep an eye on the locator and an ear for any sound whatsoever." Harry held the large antique compass, known as the locator, that Mrs. Joyce had given him. She had unearthed it from her mysterious attic, which contained all sorts of interesting devices. The locator wasn't your average compass, although it did display north, south, east and west. But Mrs. Joyce said that was to disguise its real purpose. It was the other messages around the dial of the locator which were the important part of it. In small, carved, beautifully spidery writing, there were settings such as searching for trouble, which was the setting Harry had just used, finding help, need a friend, solve a puzzle, and other quite peculiar things. You twisted the inner dial to the setting you needed, and something would happen. At least, so Mrs. Joyce said. Harry was forbidden to use it except on a real mission. He was always glad to have the excuse to get it out of its old cardboard box where he kept it under his bed. Over the bare winter fields, Harry could see the buildings that formed Pig's Bottom Farm. A small lane turned in that direction, along which was a smattering of large, well-to-do houses. A short distance further, they entered the village of Little London. It had a "Please drive carefully" sign beneath the usual black and white name sign that marked the entrance. Mrs. Joyce took the right-hand turn onto the main street. It was lined with houses that looked snug and secure, as if they knew quite well there was nothing to be concerned about. It was so disappointingly normal that Harry, despite his great faith in Mrs. Joyce, could not help but feel that they had got the wrong direction. If anything interesting and dangerous was happening, if enemy spies were lurking anywhere, it must surely be in the real city of London, not in such safe, mundane surroundings. They passed solid brick homes behind thick fir hedges, whitewashed houses, thatched cottages that looked as nice as the ones on postcards, and the Crooked Man Inn, where they would soon be serving evening meals to people who were discussing business and planning Christmas and had no thought of danger being within 50 miles. Mrs. Joyce took a couple of turns off the main street, slowly passing down the safe lanes that snaked around the housing areas of Little London, linking all the small parts of it together in a secure chain. A few early Christmas trees twinkled from windows. TV was on in living rooms. Kids ate snacks after school and squabbled. All around them things were carrying on as normal. It seemed that only Harry and Mrs. Joyce suspected otherwise. Once they were back on the main street, they drove all the way through the village, and absolutely nothing happened. Harry held the locator, and the needle simply quivered with the movement of the bumpy old car, as if it was broken. There was nothing interesting coming through Harry's earpiece either. Harry could hear snatches of conversation between two women who were comparing the quality of supermarket turkeys, but there was nothing that indicated there was about to be an attack on his country. It wasn't unusual to pick up other bits and pieces. Not everything he heard was the business of a spy, but it was important to listen to everything and then decide what was important. That's what Mrs. Joyce always said. They drove through the tree tunnel towards the far boundary of the village, where there were no houses at all. They passed through dense woodland, with bare, stretching tree branches over thick, tangled undergrowth and tumbled piles of leaves. Mrs. Joyce pulled into the entrance to a field. Through the skeletal trees and between huge evergreen firs, several large business buildings were only just visible. The trees appeared to close right around the compound like a prickly perimeter. At least, it looked prickly with all the bare branches. In summer, it might have looked leafy and friendly. Mrs. Joyce turned the car around. She seemed unperturbed that nothing was happening in Little London, and she headed the car back to the village to once more drive its sleepy streets. They were certainly obeying the "Please drive carefully" sign. Mrs. Joyce didn't care about the big 4x4 that roared up behind them as they crawled along at a snail's pace. Harry glanced back at the man driving the large vehicle. He was big and intimidating, and was wearing dark glasses, despite it not being sunny. Mrs. Joyce carried on regardless. She was peering into the same patch of woodland which enclosed the business park that they had already passed. The 4x4 rushed through the narrow entrance into the wood, down the track into the trees. A large sign at the entrance said, "Entry to business premises only. 24-hour security on site." Harry wasn't sure why they'd need that much security, but if anywhere in this poky place was likely to house the NCCCC, however many C's there were, it was probably the business park at the end of the track down which the daunting four-wheel drive vehicle had just rushed. And then Harry saw it. A sign, smallish and not particularly inspiring, listing a number of businesses that had premises in the Little London Business Park. Among them was one for the Nature Care, Control and Conservation Centre. "That's it," said Harry. "The NCCCC." Chapter 4. Mrs. Joyce pulled the car to the side of the road, bumping into a pothole. "What did you say, Harry?" "The NCCC. It's on that sign. Remember the letters in the code? It must be that place back there." Mrs. Joyce didn't turn to look at the sign. Instead, she looked at the old locator in Harry's hand. The locator wasn't moving at all. "Anything on the ear extension?" she asked. Harry shook his head. "There were two women talking about cheap turkeys," he said. "We'll keep moving," Mrs. Joyce decided. "We're not giving up yet. If we can't find anything else, we'll go down the track to the nature conservation place you spotted. But it doesn't seem the right way to me, not the way we need to take at all." Harry realized that not only had Mrs. Joyce also spotted the sign, she had read what it stood for too. There weren't many people about as they drove back through Little London. The short December day was chilly and uninviting, and a fine misty rain had begun to fall. A couple of kids were late walking home from school. They stared at Mrs. Joyce's funny old car as they passed, and then laughed. Harry stared back indignantly. A couple of women were chatting at a bus stop. To Harry they looked like any normal women, such as his teachers at school. But as they drove past, Harry looked at them more closely. Their words and gestures seemed to match the conversation continuing in his earpiece. "They're talking about snow at Christmas time now," he said. "Who?" asked Mrs. Joyce urgently. "The two ladies at the bus stop we just passed. I think they were the ones talking about turkeys, and now they're talking about snow." Mrs. Joyce pressed a button on her ancient car dashboard. The button blended in with the other car controls, between the fog lights and the heating dial. "I don't think they can be involved," said Harry. "They look like—" He trailed off. He remembered what Mrs. Joyce said about spies. They looked normal. They blended in. Of course, Mrs. Joyce also said that sometimes people were exactly what they seemed, ordinary people who weren't spies at all. It was hard to tell which category these two women fell into. They didn't look like they were involved in a conspiracy about anything, but then neither did real spies. Mrs. Joyce read his thoughts. "They look ordinary," agreed Mrs. Joyce, "but so do we. Who would suspect an old woman and a schoolboy are capable of saving our country from destruction? But that's exactly what we might have to do." Suddenly, instead of the speedometer showing them toddling through Little London at 28 miles per hour, an image appeared, that of the two women at the bus stop. It was a clear camera image, and it was recording the women's every move. Mrs. Joyce explained, "It's one of my new remote control cameras. It's almost invisible on the road behind us. It looks like a loose stone, and it's indestructible if it's run over. It'll send an image through a signal to my dashboard. If the women move, we might be able to maneuver the camera to follow them, but we'll watch them in the meantime. We'll park here." She pulled into a parking space at the front of the Crooked Man Inn. The people in the inn could see them, but Mrs. Joyce was quite right when she said that she and Harry didn't look suspicious at all. In fact, she looked like an old lady who had lost her way. She hauled her large handbag from the back seat and handed it to Harry. "You must be hungry. We can eat while we're on surveillance. There are some sandwiches in there, and crisps and some cookies." The sandwiches were delicious, and Harry made short work of the cookies. But surveillance work was dull despite the food that helped to pass the time. They watched the image of the two women at the bus stop on the car dashboard. One was looking at her watch. The other glanced around uncertainly. They evidently didn't know they were being watched, and every movement took on new, menacing meaning. A bus pulled into the stop, and a very young man, no more than a teenager, disembarked. He approached the two women, and a short conversation took place. One of the women made some hand gestures, as if she was giving directions. The teenage boy turned, and for the first time the remote control camera showed a clear image of his face. "Well, well," said Mrs. Joyce, "my bones were right again. I never would have thought that he would be involved in... But never mind about that. The point is, the plot is about to begin, and we must stop it." Chapter 5. Mrs. Joyce rummaged in her capacious bag, ignoring the badly wrapped remaining sandwiches that Harry had tossed back inside, and removed a battered old walkie-talkie. At least, that's what it looked like on the outside. She flipped up a screen, and Harry gaped at the shining new smartphone that was concealed within. "They got me an update at last," said Mrs. Joyce carelessly. She never said who "they" were. She held the device up and snapped a distant photo of the young man, who was not only looking in their direction, but was now coming their way. He had fair hair, and just now he looked very serious. His eyes were concealed behind thick-rimmed glasses, and to Harry he didn't look like the stereotypical criminal, big and fierce and scowling. Instead, he looked like a short-sighted student who had just had a bad day. Mrs. Joyce rapidly pressed keys on the phone, and the photo made a whooshing sound as it went through the airwaves, or internet waves, or phone waves, or however she sent it, maybe even through waves she had invented, to important people in the government. At least, that's what Harry supposed. "Now they must take us seriously," she said. "Who is he?" asked Harry, watching the approaching teenager. "Well, I've never met him, but he's on the authorities' radar, and he has the reputation of being brilliantly clever. I thought he was on our side, but who knows what he's doing mixed up in this affair. Since our incompetent agents haven't turned up here in time, we must follow him and find out." The teenager was already closing in on them, making rapid strides to the car park in which Mrs. Joyce's funny old car was badly parked. At last the locator device began to move. It shook in Harry's hand, the needle fidgeting furiously and wavering around "trouble found," before making a further jerky move to "helpful clue." Mrs. Joyce was disgusted with the locator. She scolded it sternly. "It's a bit late for that," she said to it. "Put it away, Harry, in your rucksack. It might sulk for a while, but it serves it right for not being clearer." Until that moment, Harry was unaware that he had a rucksack. Not his school one, which was at his feet and contained his school books, odd spy bits and pieces he liked to keep handy, and leftover bits of food, but a new lightweight one that Mrs. Joyce produced from behind his seat. Put anything you think you might need in here, she said, and you must take this rucksack with you wherever you go in case we get separated. Remember, it's got all you need, even for Arctic conditions. And turn your ear extension to home now, so I can communicate with you. We must act as if you and I are innocently waiting for someone. We must not be noticeable. This could be a very dangerous situation. You or I must keep that young man in sight. You're wearing your spy belt? Good. And you've got your wrist blaster on? And your spy glasses handy? Yes, perhaps put them on now. Then you won't be caught unawares. All the time she was speaking, Mrs. Joyce was observing the teenager, who was getting nearer. Just as he reached them, she pulled a pack of old photos from her bag and began to show them to Harry. Some of them were even black and white. Harry was good at acting his part, and did his bit, looking interested, and not looking at the approaching stranger at all. But they needn't have worried that the strange spy, if he really was that, was interested in them. They looked so innocent that he simply walked past the car and straight into the Crooked Man Inn. Just like that, he vanished from sight. "Quickly now, Harry," said Mrs. Joyce. "We know what we must do." Harry didn't exactly know any detail, but he realized that the young man must not be let out of sight. Together Mrs. Joyce and Harry entered the picturesque inn. There was a lovely open fire burning brightly in the grate. A few early customers sat around enjoying the warmth and calm of a quiet country inn. A real Christmas tree was in place in the corner, and a rendition of Jingle Bells was playing softly in the background. The teenager had approached the landlord behind the counter. Mrs. Joyce made a quick movement with her hand, and immediately Harry sent a small dart flying from his wrist blaster towards the teenager's conversation. It landed expertly, nicely concealed beneath the lip of the counter. Harry fiddled with his earpiece as Mrs. Joyce made normal conversation about what treat Harry might like, as if he was a small boy, not a real spy in training. The young man vanished through a door at the side of the counter. "I need the toilet," Harry said to Mrs. Joyce, and she understood at once. Harry had overheard the conversation through the minute microphone on the dart, which had been relayed to his ear-extension earpiece. The young man was headed for the toilets. "Off you go then, dear," Mrs. Joyce said, smiling at all the people around and at the landlord too. "I'll be here when you get back." A few folks smiled at the sight they made, the sweet old lady taking her young charge out for a treat. Mrs. Joyce walked past the counter, discreetly removed the dart, and placed it in her bag. Then she took a seat by the fire and opened a random newspaper. Through her spy-glasses, similar to the ones that Harry was wearing, except that they were also real glasses and she always wore them, she could see through small angled mirrors in every direction. She settled down to see what would happen next.